All right, today we're going to continue our tour of the different Latin American regions. So today we're going to talk about the western part of South America, which is generally called the Andean region, named after the Andean mountains. So we're going to cover that region from about their independence era, starting around 1820 or so, and up until about the 1890s. There's several different major countries along the western coastline of South America. So we're going to start in the north with Colombia and work our way all the way down to the southern tip with Chile. One thing to remember about each of these different countries as they develop is that the landowning elite and the investor class usually sit at the top of each society, not just in terms of economic wealth, but also in terms of political power. So they will be the powers that basically run these countries as they develop throughout their first century. They will often allow newly rich investors who have figured out one way or another of getting rich in their country to move into politics and to have some amount of voice. But those new investors often kind of have to force their way into politics. Military leaders will also rise to the top. So there's a lot of kind of political battles going on in each of these different countries. But in general, the business elite are the ones running these countries, and they're always looking for new talent, younger talent, basically new and rising families to kind of bring them into the ruling circle. But in general, that also left out the most of the general workforce out of the political scene. So there is a kind of what we would today call middle class of kind of white collar type workers, engineers, technicians, government bureaucrats, even teachers on some level. But they are not usually kind of unified with the peasant working class in farms or in the few factories that will be built in the area. So there's no real major political power for the working classes to build up. They don't have enough unity amongst themselves to challenge the business elite for political power in general throughout the rest of the century. We'll start off with Colombia. So Colombia geographically is split into three different kinds of regions, largely because of the mountain ranges that tend to dominate the central part of the country. So the mountain range tends to separate or split the country into three different major sections. An eastern plains to the east of the mountain range, a western kind of coastal and plains region out toward the Pacific coastline, going west from the mountain ranges toward the Pacific Ocean, and then a northern area that is largely coastal and has a lot of major ports on the Caribbean Sea. So Colombia is one of these interesting countries that borders both the Pacific and the Atlantic and Caribbean Sea really all at the same time. So Colombian ports will have access to paths to go to out into the Pacific Ocean to trade with the western coastline of the Americas and go out toward the kind of Pacific civilizations out toward East Asia. And they'll also have ports that face going north up into the Caribbean Sea, up into the Caribbean islands, and from there North America and Europe. So you would think that that would be a natural advantage to Colombia's economic development. The Spanish set the capital city of their original colony at Bogota, which is here on this map with this yellow dot, which is high up in the mountains. So it's technically in the kind of eastern section or the eastern region of the country. The Spanish had tried to force different native tribes to become the colonial workforce, especially in the western part on the Pacific coastline region and in the northern part on the Caribbean coastline region. But those natives had died off in such large numbers, probably due to European diseases, that the Spanish colonists had to bring in large amounts of African slaves to be the workforce for those areas. So as a result, the Colombian population over the 1800s will be ethnically mixed between Native Africans, Native Americans, and Spanish colonists, and eventually the Spanish colonists will kind of turn into the Revolutionary era and be the first kind of political leaders of the country. The Colombian economy developed very slowly in the 1800s. largely due to political instability and the fact that this mountain range really splits the country into three different sections. So there's not much internal trade that can develop because you have to go over these mountains to access from one region to another. So that was made the economic development of the country extremely difficult in the 1800s until they start to build railroads to try to link those different regions together. But that's largely by the late 1800s they'll even get started with that. Right at independence, you get an interesting occurrence with the Andean region. And that's because a lot of the major revolutionary leaders from the northern coastline of South America and what is today Colombia and Venezuela took it upon themselves to not just declare independence for Venezuela and Colombia, but to also try to export that revolution against the Spanish and these independence movements further down the western coastline of South America. So on this map, down to Quito, down to Lima, and even further down into modern-day Chile to some extent. And they didn't just want to export revolution, they wanted to unite all those major lands in the Andean region into one kind of South American superstate. So that was largely Simon Bolivar's kind of grand vision of what the revolution should become, and he called it Gran Colombia. And through military prowess and attacks and political deals and bribery and intimidation, a bunch of different tactics, Bolivar got at least pretty close to accomplishing that goal. So in 1826, this is a map of Gran Colombia at its height, which would dominate at least western South America, if not all of South America. So it was an extremely important event when Gran Colombia basically disintegrated into the 5 different countries we're going to be talking about today in the late 1820s. So this is a map of it in 1826, but it collapsed just a few years later. And Venezuela, its kind of exit from the Gran Colombia project, which on this map split the Gran Colombia around Bogota up at the top of the map, split that area basically in half. So the western half became Colombia and the eastern half became Venezuela. That largely removed the Venezuelan army from Colombian politics, and the Venezuelan army was basically Simon Bolivar's army. So they were the army that was trying to conquer and unite these regions. And once they go back home to Venezuela, then the Colombian army is so small that it can't really exercise a huge amount of political power within Colombia itself to more or less take over the country. So Colombia instead evolved kind of major political parties, largely a liberal and conservative party that would basically rule the country going forward from about 1830. The differences between the liberal and conservative parties were largely over the Bolivarian idea. Simon Bolivar believed in strong central government authority, largely to the point of being a dictator in different areas he conquered. And that's one reason the Gran Colombia project collapsed, because a lot of the people that were conquered didn't want to be conquered anymore. So there's a lot of conservatives who in Colombia for the long term tend to believe in strong central authority, even an authoritarian government on some level. And there's another political party, the liberals, who believe in more federalism and having a type of republic where there are regions of Colombia that have kind of independent provincial governments and they are united under a federal system, much like the United States today. They also tend to argue over the role of the Catholic Church in their society. The liberals kind of argued that the church was so powerful that it restrained economic growth and kind of education process and public debate, whereas the conservatives argued that the church was needed because it created social order and cohesion and stability and stood up against kind of radicalism or atheism or something like that. So power shifts back and forth between the two parties over the first couple decades or so of Colombia's existence. The liberals win elections or get someone into the presidency, and every once in a while the conservatives will win elections or similarly get a general or someone promoted into the presidency. So they largely kind of politically fight against each other. They bicker, they vote against each other, and they're not really very willing to compromise very much for the first few decades at least. One of the more famous presidents in the early era is named Hilario Lopez. He was first elected in 1848, and he is a Liberal Party leader. And under his watch, he pushed Colombia to end slavery, which is a giant development in the country. He also expelled the Jesuits, which was a kind of subgroup within the Catholic Church, and ended the church's right to put their own members on trial within their own system, rather than anyone who's accused of breaking the law, who's a Catholic Church clergy or part of the bureaucracy, rather than them going on trial in some kind of public civil courtroom. They used to be tried in the kind of Catholic Church's trial system. So Lopez ended that also. So he is seen as one of the big leaders in attacking the church's power and getting laws passed to remove the church's power in certain instances. And then the Liberals went from there and won the next election in 1852, which put President Jose Maria Obando in office. And the Liberals at that point take it upon themselves to write up a whole new constitution and make this constitution far more secular than the previous one. So gave all kinds of changes to the society, separated church from state, fully legalized marriages and divorces on the civil level, so that you could get married or divorced just by going through the civil legal system rather than having to go to the Catholic Church. Abolished the death penalty, massively reduced the size of the army, and gave voters the power to elect their governors over their local kind of province directly, rather than being appointed by the president themselves. So with this new constitution, Obando dissolved his own government and called for elections to occur. But before those elections could occur, in 1844, a civil war broke out between basically the elite politicians, both liberal and conservative, versus the military, who allied with the general working class. So this is one of the few times you'll see the workforce in one of these Andean countries rise up and have some amount of political voice. The problem is that they lost the Civil War, even though they had the military on their side. The politicians won the Civil War by the end of 1854. And then the elections went forward in 1856, and conservatives actually won that election and took both houses of Congress. So they hated the new constitution that Maria Obando had put forward, and so they write up a whole new one just a few years later in 1858 that pretty much undid most of the major changes that the previous constitution under the Liberals had effected. So the new constitution still kept reducing the size of the army and gave more power to the provincial governments and more independence to them. But this also quickly, just a year later in 1859, led to a new civil war, which pretty much devastated the country and the economy along with it. So even after the Civil War ends in 1863, the Liberals will win elections from then on for a while, and they'll stay in power. But they are so afraid of central government that they will write up an even newer constitution in 1863 that continues to weaken the central government to the point that it really couldn't even run the country much at all. So at that point, you don't have national civil wars going on in Colombia, but you have a series of smaller scale civil wars going on out in the provinces. And the problem is that the central government in Bogota was just far too weak under this new constitution of 1863 to stop the civil wars in their own country going on. Another generation of politicians comes in 1880 and writes a new constitution in 1886 to try to solve that problem, to create a much stronger central government to at least ensure basic law and order and stability throughout the country, and also brought back the Catholic Church into a more powerful position. But even though the Catholic Church is kind of re-empowered in the country, the new constitution also demands full religious toleration for all different faiths in the country. Ecuador is much the same and possibly even more chaotic. Spain, as a colonial power, had never paid much attention to Ecuador. Ecuador is further south from Colombia. So the Spanish had never really built much of a big economy in a city around Quito that becomes eventually known as Ecuador. The whole region around Quito becomes known as Ecuador upon independence. So there just wasn't much of an economy in the area that the Spanish had built up, because the Spanish were more concerned with other regions in the Americas to develop. So most of Ecuador at independence in the 1820s is mostly rural, agricultural, raises cash crops for export, has quite a lot of very low-wage labor going on in those farms. So its first kind of big economic boom will hit quite a bit later, after the 1880s, when it becomes a kind of European fad to start consuming chocolate, and especially milk chocolate. And that was a great thing for Ecuador, because Ecuador could produce cacao in large amounts. So Ecuador quickly grew to be one of the world's great cacao producers to make the chocolate out of. At any given year in the late 1800s, Ecuador produced between 15 and 20% of the entire world production of cacao. So it's largely in the coastal areas, and that became the kind of central focus of their economy. But that doesn't happen for a long time. I mean, the 1880s is 60 years after. That's several generations of people that have come and gone before Ecuador undergoes its first kind of great economic growth. And in that time, from 1820 to about 1880, there are a ton of different political groups and parties, and even different constitutions. Ecuador has been politically unstable pretty much for its entire history. It has had 21 different constitutions in the past 200 years. So that's in general, a new constitution every 2 years. And in 200 years, only 20 different presidents have completed their term of office. So they've either been overthrown or assassinated or died in office, or something has happened to them. So, I mean, that's less than half of their sitting presidents that they've had in their entire country didn't even fulfill their entire presidential term. The first real big famous president was General Juan Jose Flores. So he was Ecuador's first president when it broke away from Crown Colombia in 1830 and became a real independent country. And Flores will stick around, even though he's not going to be president for all these years, but he'll stick around politically for about 30 years. So he has a long political career, largely because he's the head of the military even after he left the presidency. And then he'll try to run for office in the presidency again every once in a while. But he will definitely be politically involved, maybe in the background as a military officer, and one of the more powerful ones in the country. And under Flores' influence, he and his political party and his cronies, for lack of a better term, will basically set up a tradition in Ecuadorian politics that largely resembles the caudillo politics that we saw in Mexico, and are getting replicated throughout much of the rest of Latin America throughout the 1800s. So many textbooks will call Latin America in the 1800s the caudillo era, the era of the landowners and the wealthy elite kind of fighting against each other politically and sometimes militarily for power. And Ecuador also develops two general political parties. One is the liberals, who have support from the business elite, largely in the city of Guayaquil. And another political party called the conservatives, that are mostly based in the kind of landowning elite, largely based around the capital city at Quito. And those are the two parties that will basically fight each other for power for the rest of the century. The liberals took power in a coup, which is an overthrow of their own government, in 1851, that put a General Jose Maria Urbina in power. And Urbina was a pretty ambitious person. He pushed the government to completely end slavery in Ecuador that same year that he got into office. and then he really tried to keep some stability for the next few years, but he and his party lost control in 1859 when a new civil war broke out. And the Conservative Party largely won that civil war and put their favorite person, Gabriel Garcia Moreno, in power in 1861. And they wrote a new constitution in 1861, and also he would rule as an authoritarian for the most part. He is technically a president, called the president, but he was mostly an authoritarian who ruled with the landowners supporting him until his death in 1875. So he never willingly leaves office, and he never does leave office. He dies in office. So the new constitution that they passed in 1861 made Catholicism the official state religion. So everyone in the country was obligated to be Catholic if you're religious at all, and to attend Catholic services, Catholic church services. And then the Conservatives wrote another constitution in 1865 that said that only Catholics could be legal citizens in the country. So that's pretty extreme. Moreno and the Conservatives also built up a kind of public education system and built higher education, university system, which largely relied on a Catholic sect called the Jesuits. And the Jesuits usually have a reputation for being kind of major intellectuals, and they, argue about the nature of religion and their place in it. And so under Moreno, there is some amount of kind of progress on education. And that's really where we're going to leave Ecuador and continue moving further south into the next country to the south, which is Peru. One of the big things about Peru in the 1800s is that it actually has a labor shortage. There just are not enough people in Peru to do the work that is necessary to keep the economy going. You can see by the map that Peru is heavily mountainous, virtually throughout its entire country. The labor shortage pushed the early governments to basically invite immigrants from pretty far-flung places around the world to come into Peru and have a chance at getting a farm or getting a land or doing something. So a lot of Chinese and Japanese and even Middle Easterners will move into Peru in the 1800s because there's a fairly welcoming political atmosphere for them to come in and kind of bring their families and set up shop as best they can. In the 1800s, the Andean economies and Peru were mostly cash crop and export oriented. So they grow, each country tends to grow kind of one major crop, and they get it to market, put it on boats, and send it out to the rest of the world to be sold. Which means that the families who controlled the large farms or the plantations, or whatever you want to call them, the big landowners, they basically control the economy, and therefore they control the politics. It also makes places like Peru and the Andean region very susceptible to any big changes in the price of whatever that crop is. So if the price goes up real fast, then the landowners can make a whole lot more money, and the economy does fairly well for its time. But if there's a dip in prices at all, it's economic catastrophe, sometimes for the whole nation. And even in the good times, when the prices were high and the money was moving around fairly easily, that often invited foreign investors to go into the country and try to buy up land to also make as much money as they could. So even in the boom times, there's a kind of threat to the national economy from outside. One of Peru's main exports throughout the 1800s is called guano, which is basically calcified bird dung, which is an extraordinary fertilizer that can be kind of preserved and put in packaging and put on boats and sent around to the rest of the world. So throughout the 1800s, especially Peruvian guano is one of the best kind of nitrate-based fertilizers in the world. So there's a huge world demand for it as the human population tries to grow food in places that doesn't have as good soil as they had used previously. So, and in Peru's instance, the guano mostly tended to accumulate on islands just off the Peruvian coastline that the Peruvian government owned. So the government created a system that they call the consignment system, which is basically that they sold monopoly rights to any company to harvest the guano for a certain amount of time. So it's kind of has an end date on this company's permit. And that company would have a monopoly to basically gather up as much as they could and sell as much as they could to maximize their profit. So the monopolies were economically encouraged to go into these islands and basically take as much as they possibly can and not really be concerned about the long-term ecological stability of the island, because they don't care about 10 years from now what's the guano harvest going to look like, because they only have a permit for a couple of years. So the monopolies had an incentive to go in and get as much as they can as fast as they can and maximize profits immediately, whereas the government had more of a incentive to try to stabilize the production and use of guano over time so it doesn't get exhausted and disappear. So the government had a very different interest than the kind of shorter term profit motives of the individual companies that they were selling the monopolies to. So the monopolies brought in a fair amount of money to the Peruvian government, but also did a lot of damage to the islands themselves. And the really sad thing is that the government's revenue that it generates from selling these monopolies mostly went to pay off foreign loans, largely to European bankers. So it's not like the government kept that money and was able to reinvest in building roads or hospitals or schools or whatever. A lot of that money just went into basically monthly payments to banks. And that, of course, did great damage to Peru's long-term ability to develop its own economy. And its economy was in pretty bad shape right after the independence wars ended. The wars in the early 1820s, 18 teens had largely destroyed the economy, much like other areas in Latin America who had a lot of warfare going on during the independence era. So it did take very large loans from foreign bankers, largely Europeans, to get enough capital, enough money to start to rebuild the economy after the independence wars, and that's what put the Peruvian government in that indebted position in the first place. Peru in the mid-1800s had somewhere around 1.5 million residents, and somewhere around 70% of them were natives who had lived in the area for eons possibly. The Spanish government had used a kind of tax on tribes in order to try to get either labor or money out of the natives. The Peruvian parties at independence start using what they called a head tax, which is basically a tax on each individual native. And of course the natives absolutely hated that even more. So the natives will start to try to develop a kind of mestizo identity so that they could escape taxation by proclaiming that they're not really native, they're mestizo. And much like the other countries we've talked about so far, Peruvian politics were absolutely chaotic after the 1820s. The sitting president in 1841 died in office, and that allowed an opportunity for a military officer named Ramon Castilla to take over the Peruvian government a few years later in 1845. So he rules as a fairly authoritarian, but he does some pretty important things to try to bring Peru out of a kind of backward political state and try to make their government and their economy more efficient. Number one, he establishes a national budget and other types of central government planning for the long-term development of the country. And that includes railroads, especially the railroad from the capital city out to the coastline. Builds up public works like road networks, government buildings, things like that, to try to get the Peruvian economy to grow. He also ended the head tax on the native populations which made a lot of natives happy. And he also freed black slaves. So there's a big reduction of slavery, if not a complete eradication of slavery, under Castilla's watch in the 1840s. He also, in order to combat labor, also opened up the nation's doors to immigrants to come into Peru to provide a workforce that needs to be replaced now that the slaves have been freed. So largely Chinese workers and Polynesian workers, which are East Asian islanders basically, start flooding into Peru largely in the 1850s through 70s to make up for the loss of all that slave labor. Castilla also built up the military, so he invests in modernizing the military as best he can and building up the amount of soldiers under arms, and also tried to build up public education. So his official term of office was for 6 years. He got in power in 1845, so he was basically termed out in 1851. So he leaves office in 1851, someone else becomes president. But he wasn't happy with what that president was doing, so actually overthrew that president in 1855 and put himself back in power, and he would remain president for another 7 years until 1862. So many historians argue that Castilla was one of the real stabilizing forces in Peruvian politics, but that's somewhat debatable, and a lot of other historians disagree because they say, well, the only reason he got into power for his 2 terms as president in the first place is that he overthrew the existing government. So how can you proclaim to bring stability when you're overthrowing the government that existed before you? But he's in office till 1862, and when he leaves, another couple presidents are elected. The one that was elected in 1868 felt that the national debt was getting so desperate that he sold to a private company, a French company actually, the power to manage all of the guano reserves. In exchange, that company also had to take on the full Peruvian national debt. So that shows you how valuable those guano reserves were to foreign investors. But it was also valuable to the Peruvian people themselves. They feel like often the guano reserves are like their national inheritance. It's their one of their most important exports, so it's a big centerpiece of their economy. So a lot of Peruvian people saw what this president did as basically selling out their country to a foreign company and letting foreigners run their national inheritance. So that wasn't a very popular idea. So the next president, who was elected in 1872, is named Manuel Pardo. And his big policy is to renationalize the nitrate fields, the guano fields. And in doing so, he is worried that that might start some kind of war, so he signs a military alliance with a country next door called Bolivia. And it, in fact, does lead to a war that becomes known as the War of the Pacific, which here's a map of here. So we have Peru way up in the north, Bolivia to the east, and the war will be fought between them and Chile in the south. So this war happened because there were foreign investors from Chile who had bought up a whole bunch of guano reserves in Bolivia along the coastline when Bolivia had this part of the coastline that's kind of slanted in green and yellow lines. So Bolivia used to go all the way out to the coast at Antofagasta. And a bunch of Chilean investors had bought up a bunch of those lands where the guano was in Bolivia. And the thing is that they refused to pay taxes on those lands when Bolivia passed a law to increase taxes on it. And so that angered the Bolivian president so much that the Bolivian president ordered his army to go into the place and just take the land from the investors. And of course then the Chilean investors call up their own government and the Chilean army goes into the area, and that's how the war breaks out between Bolivia and Chile. And Peru joined the war because it had signed a military alliance with Bolivia. So Peruvian soldiers start trying to move in also. to make a fairly long story, 4-year war, fairly short, basically the Chilean troops won the war and invaded so far up into Peru that they actually occupied the capital city, Lima, and that forced Peru and Bolivia to ask for a peace treaty. And in that peace treaty, it goes very well for Chile. They get a whole bunch of very valuable land, which you see here on the map. So if I can get my little arrow in here, this area that used to be part of Bolivia, Bolivia is forced to give that to Chile. This area here used to belong to Bolivia before the war. This is where a lot of the controversy had started. And because the Chileans won the war, they forced Bolivia to give these lands to Chile. So this becomes part of Chile. And the Chileans also made a similar demand from Peru, which was to occupy and control and eventually get these lands from Peru. So Chile makes out pretty well as a political entity. A lot of soldiers may have disagreed because they're the ones getting killed. But the Chilean politicians and landowners make out pretty well by gaining all this territory, and fairly valuable territory, because right after the war ended, Chile goes into a nitrate boom, a guano boom, basically, and Bolivia has completely lost access to the coastline. So they're cut off from the ocean, from trade. And Bolivia and Peru basically go into an economic decline for several years afterward. And that sends us into Bolivia's history. So Bolivia, much like the rest of the countries we've been talking about, is an Andean civilization, largely dominated by a mountain region that kind of splits their country in half. The original capital city was at Sucre, which is here with the orange dot further to the south. And it was named after the kind of big military general who won the wars and helped them proclaim independence. And so they made him the first president as a thank you, and named the first capital city after him. So that would be Bolivia's capital city throughout most of the 1800s until they move it to La Paz, which is where this green dot is, in 1898. And La Paz is interesting because most of the city is well over 10,000 feet in elevation. Some parts of it are over 13,000 feet because it's in the mountains. So it is the highest elevation world capital in existence today. It's still the Bolivian capital city. So Bolivia's economy, much like the rest of them, were pretty much annihilated in the independence wars of the 1820s. Bolivia's economy in the Spanish era was mostly silver mines in the southern area called Potosi, and the mines were flooded and destroyed to a large extent during the independence wars. So the new government had major economic problems, and its agricultural production basically stagnated, and that created all kinds of instability. The first president, Antonio José de Sucre, was one of Simón Bolívar's head lieutenants that went around and tried to build all these countries into Gran Colombia. And Sucre was fairly good at it. He was fairly successful. But he was much less successful as president of Bolivia. So he actually chooses to retire as president after just a few years and go back home to Quito, which was where he's from. And he was killed before he got there. He was assassinated by some people who weren't happy with his military career, to put it bluntly. So the next president tried to form a confederation between Bolivia and Peru, but the country to the south, Chile, found that to be such a threat that they actually started a war that the Chileans fairly easily won, and forced the president of Bolivia, who had started all this stuff, into exile. So Bolivia and Peru remained separate countries. Bolivia was pretty politically unstable for about the next 30 years. And same old story. The landowners, the caudillos, and the military leaders basically fight amongst themselves for power, and they have a bunch of different presidents, and there's not a whole lot of stability really at all. One of the more famous of these is named Manuel Isidro Belzu. He gets to the presidency in 1848. Largely because he was one of the first Bolivian politicians to appeal directly to the lower classes, the lower class mestizos and peasant farmers, and asked them for political support to get into power, and basically promising to do things for them if they got him into power. So Belsu will raise what we call protectionist tariffs, which means he will raise taxes on imports from other countries in order to increase the price of those imports and make domestic produced goods more attractive in the domestic markets. So protectionist tariff basically means if you as a consumer, as a buyer, go to a store and you see two of the exact same types of goods on a shelf, say one of them's from Peru, and they had to pay like a 10 or 20 or even 50% import tax to get their I don't know, bottle of wine or whatever you want to call it, shovel or whatever you're looking to buy, just to get it onto that shelf, that basically increases the price on the shelf by 50%. And kind of Walmart theory kicks in. Everyone wants to save money when they go buying stuff. So if you see two items on a shelf that are basically the same, and one of them is kind of half price, you'll probably buy the cheaper one just to save money. So that's what protectionist tariffs do. They raise the price of imported goods in order to motivate people to buy stuff that's made in your own country. So Belsu did that. He also closed foreign-owned warehouses and said that only Bolivians could trade internally. Only Bolivian companies can run most of the trade within Bolivia. So that was his kind of payoff to the lower classes, hoping that that would spur economic development in the country so much that would raise wages and opportunities for the lower classes. Belsu actually willingly retired from the presidency in 1855, becoming the first Bolivian president to do so in almost 30 years, since Sucre did it himself in 1829. So that shows you again how much instability there was up until Belsu got into office. Another major president in Bolivian history is Mariano Melgarejo. And his big thing is to push a new law that gave gave the government power to confiscate native lands and resell them at auction unless the natives who had formerly owned those lands can register and pay a fee to stop the sale. And of course the problem is that a lot of natives don't work for money, they work communally. So they don't have money laying around to defend their lands from confiscation and going to auction. So the law really targeted natives, not just to get money out of them, but also to just take their land and redistribute it to usually major landowners. Because just like today, the people who go to auctions to buy cars or houses or something like that are people who tend to have a lot of cash on hand. So the general workforce doesn't have enough money to go to house auction, where you might be able to get a very discounted price on a house, but you're still going to have $100,000 in cash just to participate. So it's usually rich people who do this kind of stuff, and that means that the rich increase their lands, they increase wealth. Melgarejo also pushed for free trade agreements, as we call them today, which means getting rid of tariffs on imported goods, taxes on imports. He also sold some of Bolivia's land to neighboring countries like Chile and Peru. And that angered a lot of Bolivians so much that they accused him of basically selling out their country and selling out the peasants, and the natives obviously hated him. So there's a general kind of uprising against him in 1871 that pushed him out of office and even kick him out of the country. That sends us in the 1870s to the War of the Pacific again. It starts in 1879, which, it was all kinds of problems for Bolivia. Forced Bolivia to give up even more land, especially to Chile. And Chile, took over that area along the coastline and cut Bolivia off from coastal trade completely. The kind of silver lining in that war for Bolivia is that the politicians who took Bolivia into that war, the caudillos, were so humiliated at the disastrous consequences of that war for the country that it generally is seen to have ended the caudillo era in Bolivia. So that allows different types of landowners to kind of move into power and kind of start trying to build up the country internally through road networks and transportation, and trying to develop some regions, especially in the east of the country, that hadn't been developed at all yet. So the War of the Pacific that ended in 1883 was so disastrous that, again, it ends the caudillo era and puts Bolivia into a different economic era that we'll get into in much more detail later on in the course. And that leaves us with the last country on our list, so moving way down far into the south of South America, which is Chile. And you can see on the map, Chile is a very kind of long coastal strip from basically Peru, stretching all the way down to the southern tip of South America. Chile's geography made it extremely difficult for the Spanish colonizers to penetrate and colonize. There are deserts in the north, which you can see on this map kind of in the yellowish area. Cape Horn in the south is an area where there are massive storms out in the seas, so that makes it very hard to access from the south. And of course the Andean mountain range just runs up the whole coastline where Chile is, which kind of divides the country into several different kind of mini regions. And the Spanish found it so difficult to colonize the area because of those geographic problems that native resistance to Spanish colonizers was very fierce and very successful for quite a long time. So the Spanish, they can't get enough people in there. They can't retain control over the place because of native resistance, and they really didn't find much kind of natural resources that they were after, like gold or silver, that they really could get excited about. So they didn't really heavily colonize Chile much at all for centuries. So by the time you get Chile as an independent country in the 1820s, Chile is largely an agricultural economy. There's some fertile land in the central region, which is in green on this map. And it tended to, again, be controlled by major landowners. They tend to grow fruit and grain. And because Chile's population was so small, a lot of that agricultural produce, that food, is put on boats and shipped to Peru, where the big population center is in kind of western South America. So post-revolution, Chile's economy stagnated. The government tried to respond with protectionist tariffs, raising taxes on imports in order to kind of spur the Chilean economy to develop faster. It didn't really work very well. Chile will go into a bit of a economic growth period starting around 1850, largely because of the California gold rush. Suddenly a lot of Europeans want to get into California, and the only way you can do that by boat completely is to sail around the southern tip of South America and go up the western coast of the Americas until you get to California. So there's a lot of trade ships and just kind of passenger ships that are bringing people around the southern tip, and after they get around those area of storms on this map, which is Tierra del Fuego, once they start going up the western part of South America, they want to stop off and resupply. So that really spurs economic growth in Chile, because there's so many people coming through looking for goods to buy and places to stay and eat and resupply and all these kinds of things. The problem, though, is that the United States built a transcontinental railroad that was finished in, I think, 1869 or so. So a lot of those ships stopped sailing around southern tip of South America in the 1870s, because a lot of the people will just take a ship to like New York or Boston or something and then start getting on trains to go to California across the United States. Chile did have a mining sector, eventually did develop silver mines and copper mines and some nitrate resources, largely the guano fields that they're trying to conquer and did conquer in the late 1800s. But even though those get developed, the people who own those mines still cannot develop enough wealth or power to really challenge the central landowners who tend to dominate the government. So the landowners themselves are smart enough to kind of get their kids to intermarry into families that own mines or own some guano lands or something like that. It's kind of hedge their bets and develop power relationships with other families over time. So talking specifically about the Chilean government, the first major leader of the Chilean government at independence is a guy named Bernardo O'Higgins, who basically created an authoritarian dictatorship right at independence and put himself at the top of it and tried to stay in power for as long as he could. He mostly rigged the Constitutional Convention in his favor to write a constitution that was, gave him what he wanted. But a general uprising amongst the politicians in 1823 kicked him out of office. And then you get the development of liberal and conservative parties pretty quickly after O'Higgins is out. And the conservatives largely start to win elections and keep power from about 1830 into the 1860s. Diego Portales is one of the most famous conservative party leaders in Chilean history. He's only around in the 1830s. He was never president himself. He was more a kind of party organizer who would put his friends and supporters in the presidency or other powerful offices, and they would rely on him to basically run fraudulent elections so that they could stay in power. And sometimes when the population complained about this fraud, they would use repression, military repression against the population to keep them under control. So a lot of people in history books portray Portales as a dictator, even though he's never in the executive office. He's never the president. He's never the king. He's never anything like that. He's one of the people who kind of works in the shadows. Portales pushed the Conservative Party to go into a war against Peru in 1836, which failed and caused so much anger amongst the politicians and even amongst the army that they assassinated him in 1837. The assassins seem to have thought that the country generally, by and large, hated him so much that they would applaud his being murdered, and didn't turn out that way. The Chilean population largely turned against the assassins and demanded them to be either kicked out of the country or have them executed. And the next kind of big president in line a few years later is another general named Manuel Bonus. Basically, at the end of the war with Peru, he kind of rebuilt the Chilean military real quickly and went off on an invasion and actually defeated Peru and won the war. So he was a military hero at the end of the war, 1838, 1839, and ran for the presidency in an election and won. So he becomes president in 1841. His big policies are to launch invasions to conquer the southern straits down around Tierra del Fuego, down around the Cape Horn area, to bring them fully under Chile's control. And he also built up a university system in Chile. There's a major university in Santiago, and that kind of invited a whole bunch of intellectuals from around Europe and other parts of Latin America. And so Santiago kind of has a growing literary and academic scene in the 1840s and 50s, and largely still does today. So he stays in office for 10 years. One of the bigger political questions, though, in Chile, even in going into the 1850s and late 1800s, is the church's role. So liberals generally wanted to limit the church's authority and influence, whereas the conservatives mostly wanted to defend it. But even as the liberals continued to kind of attack the church and try to reduce its influence and power in society, even a bunch of the liberals start to kind of soften their stance in the 1850s. which kind of very much splits the Liberal Party into two different types of factions. One of them calls themselves the Radical Party, that wants to keep the entire anti-Catholic Church stance, and the rest of the Liberal Party kind of splits off, and they will continue calling themselves the Liberals, who become more kind of favorable toward the church. So the Liberal Party basically splits in the 1850s. And the Conservative Party, they largely split along economic lines. The Conservatives will largely split into politicians who want to defend the church just because they believe in the church's influence as a stabilizing force in society. But there's also a bunch of other Chilean politicians that want to defend the church for an investment for themselves, who think that the church has historically, throughout Latin America, has been a major landowner, as we've talked about before, and has also lent money. The church has acted like a bank, basically, to a lot of entrepreneurs, lending them money to get businesses off the ground in return for interest rates and whatnot, for profit for the church. And a lot of those politicians want to really create government systems that would take over those money-lending business opportunities in the church's kind of economic role, and also create government entities that would take over the church's educational role. But by the 1860s, the liberals generally start to kind of consolidate power, and they will stay in power through one means or another for about 30 years. And textbooks and documentaries generally call this the liberal era of Chilean history in the 1800s. So what do the liberals do with their newfound type of power? They want to establish total religious equality between Catholics and anyone else who doesn't want to be in the Catholic Church. So that was a very kind of leftist stance in Latin America to take in that era. In 1871, the liberals also passed a constitutional amendment that limited any president to 2 terms in a row. So you can serve 2 terms, but you can't serve a third in a row. You have to basically leave office and give someone else a chance. In 1874, they passed another amendment that gave Congress the power to remove cabinet ministers. Basically, in the United States, the types that we would call like Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, the high-level advisors to the president. So that's a big change in 1874. Throughout the 1880s, the liberals will pass laws that take the power from the church of giving out marriage certificates, birth certificates, and registering deaths and burials. They'll take that from the church and give those powers to the government. So there's more kind of civil power over those kind of big stages in a person's life: birth, marriage, death, inheritance, those types of things. So that takes a lot of the church's kind of economic role in society away and gives it over to the general government. And the liberals also created voting rights for all literate men over 25, rather than the old system where you had to have a certain amount of money in your bank account to become a voter, to get voting rights. So today we would think of all literate men as all over at age 25 is a fairly small portion of the democracy, because it excludes women, it excludes people under 25, and obviously excludes anyone who hadn't gone to school to a certain extent. But for the time, that was seen as a fairly kind of leftist thing to do, to give all people, all educated men basically, the right to vote, because voting had been so restricted for so long before that. Then you have an economic depression that hit in the 1870s, and then the War of the Pacific in 1879 to 30, where Chile got extra land that it took by treaty to end the war from Bolivia and Peru. And that largely ended the economic downturns, because Chile, right after they got hold of those coastal lands from Peru and Bolivia, quickly went into a nitrate boom, which pushed its economy forward. One of the downsides of that nitrate boom is that, again, whenever you have a booming economy anywhere in the world, you'll see a lot of foreign investors come in and try to buy up the resource, and that's exactly what happened also in Chile. Especially British and other European investors came in with huge amounts of money and bought up somewhere around 2/3 of the nitrate guano industry. And nitrates would continue to be a source of economic boom for Chile and anyone else who has nitrates to sell, basically, right through the early 1900s into the 1920s. Then there's some kind of price instability during the Great Depression, and then the price of these nitrates, this guano, will just plummet after the 1940s, when some inventors come up and they develop some synthetic nitrates, some synthetic fertilizers that they can sell for a cheaper price than the kind of natural guano. So the nitrate workers were a pretty good part of the economy. They are fairly prosperous, especially if they own any amount of land themselves. So the nitrate workers are one of the first in all of Latin America to successfully unionize in the 1880s. And so they get one of the first major union movements that's successful, and they will start using that union movement not just for economic power for their workers, but also for political power. Because those union workers, those unionized workers, will show up to vote, and now they have voting rights. So with only maybe 3% of all Chilean workers as foreigners, the vast majority of them are native born. If they have a certain amount of education after the 1870s, they all get to vote. And they will start voting in large numbers in the early 1900s that will very heavily shift the political scene in Chile and serve it as an example to other Latin American populations, especially average workforces out there, if they hear about this, that they can do this too. And so you'll see a big economic and political change in Latin America, really starting in the 19-teens, 1920s, as the caudillo era generally starts to break down. But we'll talk about that in much more detail after the first test. So we'll end today, and we'll talk next time much more about the rest of South American development in the 1800s, largely Venezuela, Brazil, and Argentina.